Good evening, esteemed audience members and distinguished guests. My name is Simon Chowdhury, and I am one of the co-chairs of FESI. My co-chair Sultan Rana and would like to welcome you tonight, along with our staff advisors, Dr. Carl James and Dr. Vidya Shah, as well as Jack Negro, who is the superintendent at Durham District School Board. Welcome to this extraordinary webinar, Anti-Blackness in Education, a National Conversation. This webinar is in part sponsored by Unifor and the Network of Advancement of Black Communities, and is a joint collaboration that we will speak more about momentarily. COVID has certainly provided many challenges, but one of the opportunities it has provided is for us to rethink how we come together in conversations, in humanity, to learn, grow, and support each other. And we are grateful to all of you who are able to join us tonight. Before we move to introductions, we'd like to start by acknowledging the land. We know that we are all dispersed geographically on Turtle Island, and so please take this moment to reflect and think of the land upon which you are situated. Because we are hosting from York University, we will use the university's land acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As I read the land acknowledgement, I think of this quotes from Potts and Browns. Knowledge is produced through the interactions of people, and as all people are socially and politically located in their race, gender, ability, class identities, and so on, with biases, privileges, and differing entitlements, so too is the knowledge that is produced, socially located, and political. Knowledge is neither neutral nor benign, as it is created within and through power relations between people. Knowledge can be oppressive in how it is constructed and utilized, or it can be a means of resistance and emancipation. Potts and Brown, 2015. The history of colonization around the world is a story about control of land and resources. As this powerful, destructive system has traveled around the world, it has sought to control people and the land that has been cleared of its rightful caretakers. This land was rich in quantity, in quality, and economic resources, both above as well as below the soil. The removing of humans through whatever means, including forced displacement, labor, enslavement, social collapse, and asserting ownership over territory through violence and renaming, are connected. We continue to see examples of colonial violence and systemic racism against racialized and minoritized individuals, particularly Indigenous, Black, and Afro-Indigenous people in this country. This includes policies and laws, inequitable provisions of services, intentional neglect and exclusion, social bias, and the ways institutional policies impact the well-being of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. State violence includes a child welfare system, representation in government at all levels, healthcare, and of course, the education system, which is why we are gathered here today. Today's event is hosted in conjunction with the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora. The current holder of the chair, my apologies, is Dr. Carl James. I'd like to introduce Dr. Carl James.
Thank you very much, Seema. I am very happy to welcome everyone here participating in tonight's discussion. And we're looking forward to a very, very energized discussion and presentation by the panelists and those who will be asking questions. Typically, this event is held in an auditorium at York University, but of course, the COVID has given us this additional way of reaching not only to our local community, but throughout the country. And I very much welcome the opportunity to have this event in this way. Thanks very much for joining us, and I look forward to everything that happens this evening.
Thank you, Dr. James. And now we have some greetings from Jean Augustine herself, the Honorable Jean Augustine.
Hello, I'm Jean Augustine. I want to greet everyone as you celebrate Black History Month in Canada. It was 25 years ago that my motion designated Black History Month in Canada. I am so very pleased that Dr. Carl James and all the educators and all those in the Faculty of Education at York University and the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora are celebrating at this time. It is important that I recognize the educators, the collaborators and partners who are sharing with us in this very important conference, that you are addressing the issue of Black youth and the education of our children. In this pandemic time, in this reflective and challenging time, when on the table we are addressing systemic issues, that we are looking at anti-racist education, which must be had, when we need to grapple with the fact that in our systems that there are things that need to be weeded out, that we have to recognize and we have to make systemic change. And so I hope your conference will be fruitful. The presentations will be instructive and informative. And I look forward to hearing from each and every one of you who are part of this event, and congratulate you for all the work that you've been doing over the years and the work that you will continue to do. But at the same time, I think you have that recognition that we have to pass the baton on to our young people. So we have to make sure that they are prepared to take our society into the next era where diversity is recognized, that no one is left behind because of the color of one's skin, but that diversity and inclusivity would be the way forward. So let's move on. Have a really great conference day, and let us continue to be supportive of community efforts and work with the systems that have to make the changes for our children. Thank you.
As mentioned before, our collaboration is also a joint venture with ABC, which is the Administrators Black Caucus of Ontario. And with us tonight to tell us a bit more about ABC, as well as to introduce our panel, is Leslie Grant, who is an acting superintendent of education in the Peel District School Board and co-founder of ABC. Over to you, Leslie.
Thanks, Saima, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on which part of the country you're joining us from, and welcome. On behalf of my colleague co-founders of the Administrators Black Caucus of Ontario, we are excited to be in partnership with the Jean Augustine Chair and FESI to bring you this important conversation tonight. Last spring, as world events conspired to finally and undeniably expose the reality and tremendous trauma of anti-Black racism, ABC's founding members came together out of an urgency to address the state of education for Black students, staff, and community. The intent of the Administrators Black Caucus of Ontario has been to create a network of Black administrators to take a leading role in dismantling systemic anti-Black racism in education in Ontario. In this time of isolation, the power of affinity spaces is more important than ever. Networks like ours have allowed Black educators across the province, and indeed across the country, to connect, support, and disrupt together. In her book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to Present, Robin Maynard writes, schools in Canada remain permeated with anti-Blackness. Because Black youth are so often not seen or treated as children, schools too often become their first encounter with organized and systemic devaluation of Blackness present in society at large. Tonight, we turn our attention to the state of education for Black youth. We know that Black youth encounter anti-Black racism in education systems across the country. And tonight's conversation will explore the nuanced local challenges and efforts to disrupt and dismantle. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's panelists and moderator. For maximizing time, I'm going to offer a brief introduction only, and to learn more about each panelist, you are able to visit the FESI site at fesi.yorku.ca. So our first panelist is Beth Applewhite, District Vice Principal of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Burnaby School District, Burnaby, British Columbia. Next, we have Letitia Andrews, Education at Pearson Adult and Career Center in La Salle, Quebec. Karen Hudson is Principal at Auburn Drive High School, Cold Harbor, Nova Scotia. Gail Ann Wilson is teacher from the Edmonton Public Schools Center for Education in Edmonton, Alberta. Ainsworth Morgan is principal from the Toronto District School Board and co-founder of the 100 Strong Foundation in Toronto, Ontario. And our moderator for the evening is Camille Williams-Taylor, Director of Education for the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board in Ottawa, Ontario. Camille, thank you for lending your expertise to tonight's conversation, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And welcome everyone. Good afternoon and good evening from all across the country. Tonight's discussion will allow experienced educators from across the country to explore some of the realities that are facing Black students and their families in the public school system. Our discussion tonight will be built on the framework of the common understanding that Black excellence is a reality in our schools. Many Black students achieve great success, and talented Black educators are making a positive impact and changing the system in the interest of students and families. However, we also know that Black excellence emerges often despite the system. We know that the supremacy of a white lens and a Eurocentric reality permeates all the experiences that Black students have in their classrooms and their schools in Canada. We know that the struggle to excellence comes at a cost to Black educators, to Black families, and Black communities, compromising not only the success of Black students, but also impacting the health and well-being of the Black community and our advocates for transformation. Black excellence is a given. White supremacy in public education is real. Our panelists are experienced educators who will discuss the reality of schooling with a view to effective practices and advocacy for change. Their names have been introduced, their bios are on the website, and so at this time, I'd like to invite our panelists to open their cameras so that we can begin the discussion. I'd also invite our viewers and our participants to enter their questions into the chat because we will designate time at the end for questions and answers. We do have discussants who will extend the conversation at the end of the planned questions. And so we do anticipate inviting 3 other guests to engage in expanding the conversation further. So without further ado, and welcome to our panelists, I will begin with the first question and invite you to engage, and we will have a couple of additional comments before we move to the next. So the first question is for you, Karen. What are the social and educational experiences of Black students and families and communities in their respective local and regional contexts that are areas of concerns for educators and Black educators?
Thank you, Camille, and good afternoon and also good evening. Thank you to the Jean Augustine Chair, Dr. Carl James, the ABC Caucus, and for the organizing team. So when I think of the social and educational experience of Black students and families and communities within Nova Scotia, I feel for the students. Our students are feeling uncomfortable in a system that does not make them feel like they belong. The students feel that there are no supports, they feel exhausted, tired, and question the space, and sometimes a space that may not be always safe. And this could be due to the subliminal message that are evident because of the lack of content and curriculum. Black students are dealing with microaggressions of what is happening within the school. They experience these microaggressions every day. And sometimes the microaggressions are not being addressed. And the students feel that they're not being listened to. So the harm that they feel from racism can be equated almost to bullying. So the peers and communities, what they're trying to do is to navigate a system that was not designed for them. And there's little understanding of Blacks' lived experience and the social realities, and the harm that racism causes to the students, families, and our communities. The issue of racism and other incidents have happened so often that folks sometimes begin to desensitize and normalize. And so the students learn to live with it rather than address it. So families are being traumatized. Communities are demanding more representation and relevant curriculum. Families feel that their children have to code switch in order to fit in, because right now they're not fitting in. So will the teacher agree with them or not if the students stand up for what they believe in? Or will they just take the easy way out and do nothing, just keep the status quo? So our communities and children and families, they're feeling this Black fatigue. Our families want their children to enjoy their experience and childhood like other children who are not of African ancestry. They want the children to feel comfortable in their own skin. Parents want healthy relationships for their children. And so this is why students or communities must be an integral part of the school system. And children need to know that the people care and love them, and they want to feel the same experience and expectation as others. Thank you, Camille.
Thanks, Karen. That was very comprehensive, and you certainly gave us a lot to think about there. And you've talked about the experience that from your perspective in Nova Scotia. Letitia, I wonder if you could expand on that, because your context is somewhat different in Quebec. If you could expand on that a little bit and perhaps bring us around to some of the things that educators are doing about the observation of these experiences that our families, our students, and our educators are having as a part of the public education system.
Thank you, Camille. So just as an introductory face or statement. I'm from Quebec, and so I'm also working in an adult education center, so it's different from high school. So the students that we receive, the Black youth that we are seeing are immigrants as well as local Montrealers. And the immigrants have to go through something called a classe d'accueil, which is a welcome class. Usually they have to do that for about a year, and then they get integrated into a French curriculum. So there are French language laws that pose a barrier to some of the learning because immigrants are mandated to send their children to French schools. Therefore, if at some point they want to study in English, what they would have to do is wait till they're 16, and then they can come into the adult education system. As it pertains to our local Montrealers, usually if they're going through high school and having some academic unsuccesses, usually they might be also experiencing some lack of resources, or they might be of low socioeconomic status. What happens is those students get funneled into programs such as the work-oriented training path, WOTP. That program is a 3-year program designed for 15-year-olds. And what they will learn there are basically semi-skilled trades. And they do not leave with a high school diploma. They're going to leave with an attestation certificate of completion of about 900 hours of on-the-job training. So that still puts them at a dilemma whereby they have their dreams that they want to pursue, but at the same time, they haven't had the best academic experiences in high school. So they too might come to adult ed to then complete their high school education. So what we're seeing here is traumatized students, essentially, on both ends. And it's difficult because the teachers are trying to find a way, especially at our center. We have an 8-week or 8 to 16 week, depending on the course that's being taught, to teach these students a curriculum that they would normally do in 1 year in high school. So we have an 8-week period to connect with these students and then get them to even stay within that program within the 8 weeks. When they're already coming from a background where they feel like they are failures, where they have their dreams crushed. So that is kind of what we're facing here in Montreal, Quebec, particularly in the adult education sector.
Thank you, Letitia. And I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker on my toggle with the mute and unmute. So let's see if we can not have the you're muted, Camille, notation today. So you certainly, both Karen and Letitia, you've shared a context where I've heard you use words like aggression. I've heard you talk about barriers, structures that cause students to be funneled. Letitia, that was the word you used. Both of you talked about harm. These are really destructive experiences that the system is perpetrating on Black students. But in my introduction, I talked about excellence and excellence amongst educators. And of course, that is definitely presented here today in your presence. So my next question is going to go to you, Beth, about how it is that educators and administrators, regardless of the role that they play in education, how do they disrupt anti-Black racism? But it's a two-parter question. So the question about disruption, I know that you are already with it because you demonstrate that excellence. But I'm going to ask you also to expand to the tough part of the question, which is how is it that educators and administrators are enabling anti-Black racism as well? So over to you, Beth.
Thank you, Camille. I'd like to first acknowledge and thank the Coast Salish nations of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish, on whose traditional territories I teach, learn, and live. And just like to share that I'm very honored to be part of this much needed discourse. So thank you for having me. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. So I'll start with the disruption. And that's since the very public murder of George Floyd in the spring last year, there's been this huge surge, this huge increase in awareness, so to speak. And educators are doing lots of anti-racism learning. Folks are reading books, they're watching webinars, they're taking training, they're doing workshops. And educators, because of that, are starting to actually believe our Black youth. They're not only listening now, they're actually listening to believe and validate. So because of this, lots of educators are starting this work with younger age as well. Like one great thing that's come out of this is people are starting to realize that it's always a good time and a safe time and the right time to talk about racism and race, even with preschoolers and kindergarten through to grade 12. So that's been a positive. It doesn't look the same for the younger ones, but thematically, we can talk about race and prejudice and discrimination with the little ones as well. So that's been increasing. People had been using that as an excuse before not to talk with little ones, and so that's been a very positive disruption that's happening. People are starting to be able to admit they're racist. We've been taught that being seen as racist means that you're a bad person, and that so that I'm not racist, that's not cutting it anymore. Thanks to Dr. Kendi's book. I know lots of other folks and women of color have been saying that for decades, but he made it the soundbite of the summer. And so people are understanding that, like, it's not okay just to say, well, I'm not racist, so all's good here. Teachers and educators and administrators starting to understand that. And so they're starting to admit and acknowledge and accept and understand that we live and breathe and work in a systemic system, the education system. And they're starting to understand that it was built this way and on purpose. And so that's huge. That it's not just like, well, I'm not racist, so I'm okay. It's like, oh, okay, so the system I work in and for is systemically racist. I'm living and moving in white supremacist culture, and I need to take my blind spots off. People are starting to learn there are things that they don't know. They don't know what they don't know, but they're starting to learn, they're starting to reach out. And so that's been disruptive. There's been a push for better student teacher programs. I know our local universities here have been doing a great job, and for years, I want to acknowledge and praise the work that's already been done, but there's even more push to make it like mandatory courses for all student teachers and to have specific information about anti-Black racism. So there's push for Black history curriculum, more resources, a strong push to change and revise our codes of conduct in schools, our discipline procedures. Schools are starting to do anti-racism school goals. Districts are starting to have strategic plans that involve anti-racism. District policies some districts are starting that work. They're starting with the listening. But the enabling side, we still have a long way to go. It's a great start, but the number one problem is that white supremacist culture. It's our reality. And part of that white supremacist culture is the right to comfort. And so people don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. They don't want to have the hard, challenging conversations. They want to avoid it. And because of cancel culture, unfortunately, folks are scared to do this work because they might say the wrong thing or make a mistake, and they don't want to be the next horror story on the 6 o'clock news. It is unfortunate, but the reality of that is it's a real possibility. So the use of the N-word, not dealing with that's been enabling this white supremacy to continue, not supporting our students when they're, talking about microaggressions and macroaggressions that they face. And of course, a lot of performative allyship out there right now, right? Where people are, saying, oh, I did something for Black History Month, check, or I talked about this in class, check. They're not seeing the need for Black history and celebration of Black culture and contribution, from January to December, like Black History Month and beyond. And also, though, with that, I feel I need to say something about how some people are wanting to cancel Black History Month. Some people are going too far as well, right? And some folks who aren't Black even are talking for Black folks and saying Black History Month, anything that any racialized month is bad, right? And others. And I understand that, and there's things we can do though to meet those concerns. But I'm scared about that, about how there's a long important history of Black History Month, and I wouldn't want to see people just jump on that bandwagon of get rid of it, because it means so much for so many people to be able to celebrate contribution, achievement, Black love, Black joy, right? So I hope that's enough.
Well, Beth, you've given us a lot to think about there. I've been taking a lot of notes. Gail Ann, you are in Alberta, and I would imagine that there are some similarities to what Beth has shared. But can you expand a little bit on some of the principles that Beth has shared with us around some of the disruptions, but also the challenges that cause anti-Black racism to continue to be perpetuated and impacting our schools and our Black communities. So over to you, Gail Ann.
Thank you, Camille. And thank you all for allowing me to share perspective from here in Edmonton. Beth, you did an outstanding job of taking a look at just the entire spectrum of what we're dealing with. Both when we're talking about disruption as well as when we're talking about enabling. So thank you for starting that part of the conversation. And what I can actually add to this is how we can look at this in Alberta. So of course, taking a look at what we're doing to disrupt. And I can share one type of effort that we're seeing because when we look at this problem, what we are seeing is that educators, admin, school boards, all of them have actually been committing themselves to creating some positive change around this, but it remains independent and it remains relatively uncoordinated. So Black teachers in Alberta have actually gone as far as forming a coalition, and that group is called the Black Teachers Association. And this is a response to the social unrest that was triggered by the murder of George Floyd. So the benefit has been that being organized has resulted in a number of positive actions where we've seen leaders from the Black Teachers Association actually get those sit-down meetings with our school superintendents and actually get into the room, have a place at the table to have discussions that previously they were not invited to before. And these are really powerful discussions where we're talking about institutional racism. We're also seeing that an organized group like this is able to actually find a place at the table with the Alberta Teachers Association. And in doing this, there have been a number of really meaningful and positive outcomes, including a partnership with the BTA in order to try to see how we can actually formalize a space for a group like this to be able to speak on behalf of Black teachers in the province. So teachers are also finding a huge benefit because the formation of a group like this is allowing for easier identification as teachers on the front line are finding this an accessible place or a community of people in order to collect resources from, as well as to actually use as a touchstone to just bounce ideas off of and make sure that they're kind of moving on track. So the actions of the association boards and frontline teachers are actually all creating a path forward by attempting to disrupt racism head on and not afford racism the privilege of silence. So that's the positive. But as mentioned, the challenging part is what we see in terms of enabling. And so here in Alberta, I definitely would say we are facing challenges as well, because I would take a look at those that are actually sitting in those positions of power and ask them to address their own external biases. Because what we're seeing are expressions of racism against Black students, especially by white administrators in our province. And we've seen this where we've had instances of principals that have challenged Black students on the use, or their use, I should say, of the N-word. And in doing so, those principals have actually used the word on those students. And so that creates a crisis for those students in that moment, because it's that combination of power and prejudice that ultimately leaves those students feeling absolutely vulnerable and powerless. We've also had students in our province suspended for what was considered a dress code violation when in one instance we had a student wearing a do-rag and that student refused to remove it. So when administrators are lacking an understanding of this power and prejudice, then we can expect nothing less than a negative effect on culture, period. So that involves all of us, and on the institutional structures that they really are tasked with protecting.
So Galen, you certainly have extended Beth's great start with the question and from the point of view of the disruptions. And I think that one of the key pieces that you really raised, and we'll get to go into it a little bit more, is the whole idea of building on power, who has power, how to leverage power, and what to do with the power to create the disruption. But before we move forward, I do want to just build on one of the comments, Beth, that you talked about. And you made the comment about the fact that it is institutional racism in education is based on an institution that was built to be racist on purpose, right? So the on purpose piece goes to that institutional part of the anti-Black racism. And it harkens back to something I heard about recently. Some folks were talking about the whole idea of the institution of education. And in fact, many of our institutions that are built to serve some, but to exploit others. And while it is that might have a historical context, if nothing is done to actually change this construction of those institutions, then while it is that it may not be an intentional piece, the machinery is already in place to perpetrate those outcomes. So you touched on a few of those ideas, and I'm going to go to the next question, and this time start with you, Gail, because you have already started to kind of build on the whole notion of resistance. You built on the notion of resistance by talking about teachers organizing and how it is that they're resisting white supremacy. So could you expand a little bit for us about how members of the Black communities, as well as educators, are resisting white supremacy and anti-Black racism in all forms of schooling in Canada?
Thank you. It was a very powerful question to be asked. I spent a little bit of time really contemplating what type of response to actually make for or to provide for this question. And what I came up with is that at the core, Black people simply cannot resist white supremacy without a commitment to structural change. How I see it is that we are living in a binary society, especially here in Alberta, and that's both socially and politically. And what we're seeing are protests in the name of civil freedoms, and they're opposing mask wearing, which are in fact gatherings for white nationalism. So it's just the guise of. And so what we've had are groups promoting white supremacy, disrupting anti-Black racism and social equity marches. And we're seeing that this type of action is actually carrying over into our schools, where white students are opposing the promotion of initiatives like Black History Month. So affinity groups are forming around white pride. And ultimately what they are doing is mirroring the malevolent behavior that we're seeing in society. And these affinity groups, we have to be clear about this, are not new. This is not something that has just arrived as of last year. They are more emboldened and more savvy by claiming that they are now so commonly the victims of reverse racism. So school teachers are speaking out, school leaders are speaking out, and they are denouncing these groups and the racist values that they're espousing. So in Edmonton, the Edmonton Public School Board has actually put out a statement, as well as the Calgary Board of Education, denouncing the actions of these types of white nationalism affinity groups and anything that is in the promotion of hate. But it takes the denunciation at the highest level of the government to consistently and swiftly respond. And so Black people cannot resist the volume of white supremacy alone. We need leaders to speak up, and we need them to speak out, and we need them to deliver authentic commitments to combat racial discrimination and to move forward with action to root out racism in our schools and workplaces. But we can't rely on white leadership to actually get this right without proper consultation with the Black community. And more profoundly, without putting Black leaders in positions to speak directly to those that are aiming to oppress us. And so schools in our province must intentionally hire, retain, and promote more Black teachers, especially into areas of leadership and administration, and also into areas of curricular development. Thanks.
Thanks, Gail-Ann. And Gail-Ann, you touched on the last comment you made around curriculum development. You touch on an area of power that people often overlook because we think about what it is that our students are in front of every day and the power of the institution of the curriculum and what that does from the point of view of messaging the reality of who the Black body is, who the Black mind is, what the place of the Black person is in our communities. And so it is an indoctrination. And when it is that we don't have people seated in a position to hold the pen of that powerful structure, we certainly create a vulnerability. I'm going to pass over to Karen, who I'm going to ask you, Karen. Gail-Ann has set quite a foundation for this response around resistance. And I wonder what your perspectives are from your point of view on where it is that and how it is that Black communities are in fact resisting white supremacy and anti-Black racism in schooling.
Thank you, Camille. So just to follow up what Gail was speaking about, I'm just going to start with the part called collective agency. And she was saying how Blacks are beginning to mobilize. And that's very important in terms of the resistance, which you talked about Black leaders and being in positions, hiring of them in the curriculum development. One of the things that I noticed within the Black communities is just the understanding of that legacy of racism and addressing those negative interpretations. And this begins with the Black community rewriting the wrong in the history books, challenging those misinformations and telling the truth. Communities are beginning to write their history, and they're doing it in an honest and truthful way. They're not putting us up in terms of putting us down and addressing us in terms of the community, the larger community, judging us and not giving us our rightful place. So we need to take that back. And that's where that collective agency comes in and that mobilization that takes place. We have to also, as the Black community, we're resisting in a way in terms of that we're educating our children and we're able to identify what's happening. We're looking at, we're in two modes. One mode is that we're educating them, but the other mode is that we're in survival mode because our children are afraid to get suspended or even to get killed. So rather than them dealing, meaning educators or the white supremacists, looking at that implicit bias. So this year, one of the things that we did here in Nova Scotia is that we actually had a freedom school here. We were in Afrocentric Learning Institute had pop-ups. And when the George Floyd incident took place in May, we were preparing our students to take back, providing them with language and knowledge and information so that when they went back to school, they were equipped to deal with and deconstruct some of that misinformation that's given to them. The other thing that I believe that our Black community is doing is that we're not accepting it. We're calling it out. We're demanding those structural and political changes. We're advocating for systemic changes and accountability. And from teachers and schools, administrators, policymakers, we want them to take time to reflect on it, who we are and who we are in terms of us, Black people, but also that they need to do better in terms of taking action. So we need to make sure that in terms of this white supremacy and anti-Black racism in school, that we inform and we inspire our community and our children to motivate them to move forward with plans to prevent them from experiencing it. We know that racism will always be alive, but we make sure that we have to take it back in control. addressing issues of social justice and equity and accountability. It's always going to be long lasting in terms of the work. But we need allies as well to support us in this work of deconstructing and dismantling.
Thanks so much, Karen. And you have encapsulated some of what Gail said earlier and extended it into Nova Scotia context. And there are a couple of things that I want to just expand on, because both of you really touched this piece. Is the whole idea of telling the truth and owning the truth and telling the story. And the way that I captured it as I was listening to you is what I was hearing you say is own our story and own how it is told, right? So whether it is in the curriculum or whether it's in the community or whether it's with our children, so that they have, and to use your language, Karen, they have the language of resistance. But the one thing that I want to build on and just extend a little bit is that this is not a new phenomenon. We're referencing, George Floyd, and we're referencing the window that has opened for these conversations. But Black people in Canada and all over the world have resisted oppression ever since the beginning of our history. And so that historical context of resistance is almost built into our DNA. I really think that it's important as well to capture that you both went to the place of the role that the greater society plays in ownership of the wrongdoing and the ownership of the corrective action. And so I think, Gail, when you talked about the fact that it isn't on the backs of Black people to be the correctors, Karen, you pointed out that we tell the story and we open the story and we shed the light, but there is an ownership responsibility in the greater community. So certainly a very robust response to a rather deep question. So I'm going to shift a little bit to go to the place of school and school community partnerships. And Letitia, I'll ask you to pick up this question first. Are there school community partnerships that are helping to enhance school parents community relationships? And therefore helping them to enrich the classroom engagement and learning? Can you talk a little bit about those partnerships that you are aware of in Quebec, albeit you are working with adults, but we do recognize that there are still partners that certainly work with helping adult students and families to understand and navigate the school system better. So talk to us a little bit about those partnerships.
So we do have some community organizations that I've had the pleasure of working with. When I was actually an administrator for a very short time, I worked with Crystal Andrews with the African Canadian Development and Prevention Network, and they came to our center to discuss the stigma of mental health within the Black community. So that was one partnership in particular that was very helpful within the adult sector. Again, we don't really work a lot with parents. The only program that we have an alternative program that works or that does cover some issues within the community and parents, but adult ed as a whole does not really deal with parents. So that's just one of the community partnerships that we have. Among others, that also offer like addressing the lack of resources among certain students with food banks and whatnot. Those are the few that we deal with within the adult sector.
Letitia, could you just expand a little bit on that last piece that you talked about with issues of food insecurity, matters of where poverty intersects with some of the institutional racism, and what kinds of partnerships would adult education connect with to close some of those gaps and help adult students to navigate?
So in an effort to address that issue, because we do notice that as well, yes, we do have some Black students that are suffering with low socioeconomic status and whatnot. We actually created our own breakfast club within the school. So the students had a place to come and not just eat, but also a place that they can socialize, a place that they can feel a sense of belonging, where they can talk and integrate with both the staff as well as other peers. And I think that this was an area that created community. It was a context that's outside of academia, and it was an opportunity for them to connect. It's really important that while our students are dealing with these racial issues, that they understand that Black lives matter, that they belong, and that they are safe. And by creating this breakfast club, they had a safe space where they can just be themselves, kick back, or have open discussions about issues that they're dealing with. So that's one of the ways that we try to address the poverty issue, or at least their lack of resources.
Right. And I think that the way you just captured it there, the lack of resources, goes back to the way you started in your earlier question, when you talk about the realities of how some of these adult learners come to you, the path that they have had to take. And in some cases, you use the word survival. And I would suggest to you that it isn't just about the physical survival, but the emotional and social survival as well, to really allow them to find their way and to find their excellence. But I'll turn to Ainsworth now, who, Ainsworth, I know that in your work in Toronto, you're very active with connecting school and community and families. So can you talk to us a little bit about the value of these community partnerships and how it is that these community partnerships really help to advance the commitment to dismantling anti-Black racism as it impacts our students?
Thank you, Camille, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, I think when we talk about partnerships, community partnerships, for me, it starts with parents. It's letting them know that we're partners in their child's education. That's the first relationship you really need to develop, because they will help to guide where you go. They will let you know. I mean, we have our traditional partnerships when it comes to community centers or health centers, but within schools, you have your social workers. Within Toronto, we have community support workers that are there to sort of bridge that gap for many. But it's also looking at how we interact or engage with community through a different lens. For example, in my space, in using our social worker, it's done in a way that's proactive. Quite often, particularly in our community, there's many challenges when you're talking about accessing social work, and for good reason. Historically, we all know some of the challenges Black families have with those type of agencies. So the expectation within my space is to ensure that you're doing so, not necessarily engaging only in a crisis sort of management situation. You're being proactive. So you're allowing that person that's coming in a sort of formal capacity to support families, but they're doing so in a proactive way that's looking at helping and supporting. And I think it's the responsibility of all leaders, whether it's the teachers, administrators, senior team, superintendents, and so on. We're not the experts. The community is the experts. We have to humble ourselves, go into the space with that lens, and allowing them to educate us. I'm very fortunate to have worked with some incredible folks through our school council, formal and informal, and it's usually the ones that are informal that have sort of the greater impact. And so they recognize that there's a partnership, and you have to be honest in knowing what you don't know, and being able to put yourself out there, and allowing to learn from community. I think that's a key piece of what needs to be, and being vulnerable. It's allows us to go out into a space, speak our truths, recognizing that all Black is the Black. I always say I am of the Black community. I do not speak for the Black community, right? So I think that's an important piece, because there's many Black communities. And so within that, you have to understand the context of Toronto is very different from Edmonton and very different from Montreal or Vancouver. So I think knowing your space, and not expecting this one size to fit all, the community agencies, the families and students, they will tell you what they need. So it's really being able to humble yourself. Yes, you're in a position of power and privilege, 100%. But it's important to let those that you have been privileged to serve be part of that conversation, and in many ways to lead that conversation. And what we're allowed to do is facilitate those interactions. So I think it's really listening to community, listening to parents and students. They'll tell you what they need. It's not for us to go in there and say, hey, I have the solution. So it's that openness for that type of discussion.
Ainsworth, thank you so much. And, I almost get a picture as you're talking, about the kinds of dialogues that happen in the schoolyard at your school, and that kindergarten drop off, or, at the math night event, because when you talk about the informal spaces, those spaces are the spaces where the partnerships start to emerge, right? And a couple of pieces that when we think about partnerships, that we have to think about trust, and how is it that trust emerges? Because Ainsworth, you alluded to the lack of trust when we started to think about some of the structural partnerships that are available and present and there. That some of those structural partnerships are the very ones that have created the problem. And so how it is that that deconstruction happens. And I think that it's really important that you talk about the humility and the vulnerability piece. But one of the things that I would highlight as well is that there's a contract, whether the partnership is formal or informal. There's a contractual agreement, not something you sign, but just an agreement that I am accountable to you. And I think so that accountability piece is one that we probably need to expand on as this conversation continues tonight, because it is through accountability and through living up to the accountability that we are able to build the trust of the community and actually start to break down the barriers. So thank you both for opening that space, because I almost, as a community member, went into those spaces as you both were talking about how it is that the community is embraced in solving and addressing some of the challenges. So I'm moving into the fifth and final formal question. And so you can anticipate that we're going to get a number of questions from our questioners and from the audience shortly. But I'm going to start where I left off with you, Ainsworth, to go to a delivery question now. So what practical steps must be employed by everyone who's involved in education to address barriers to Black student success? And you certainly did start that answer with talking about the humility, but can you build a little bit on that when you give us some practical direction?
Thank you, Camille. Yeah, I think I would start this by saying with this work, particularly as Black educators, there's an assumption that it's easier because of your pigment. So therefore, there's an opportunity that others don't have to somehow by osmosis connect to these students and families. I would argue that it's actually harder to do that work. Because we don't work in isolation. I'm not allowed to just be Ainsworth Morgan, principal of a school. There's a collective responsibility. And I've shared this in the past that, if you're successful in your role, it's in spite of you. If you fail in your role, it's because of you. And so you need to be able to have that understanding. And I want to really emphasize this point. And it's really protecting your well-being, your mental health in doing this work. I'm very fortunate. My phone is blowing up right now because there's folks that I have a great support team that I don't have to code switch and have some real conversations, right? But in terms of the practical steps, it absolutely speaks to that collective responsibility and doing no harm. And so when you are planning to work within a space, you need to recognize that I have yet to meet a parent that doesn't want their child to be successful. And so what we need to be able to acknowledge is not everyone may necessarily have all the tools to be able to do so. And also recognizing that we should not always approach this work from a deficit sort of perspective. There's many students that are successful and are doing great things within our collective boards and spaces of work. So I don't want to necessarily speak to a level of doom and gloom, but as educational leaders, it's inviting folks to the table, making sure that it's an authentic partnership. It's not about the photo op. It's not about trying to put something on when certain people are in the room. It's really allowing them to recognize that they're a partner in this. There's the collective responsibility that I spoke about. We're standing on the shoulders of many that came before us. And I think it's important to acknowledge those that have paved the way for us to be able to have these conversations. Within our different boards, for example, within the Toronto District School Board, we've just created a Center for Excellence for Black Students Achievement. That's the first of its kind in Canada. And now, that didn't happen by osmosis. It didn't happen overnight. This is many years of advocacy by community, and the goal, the hope for that is to be able to speak to the excellence that is within our students and families. So I think it's being really, when you're looking at leadership, the reason something like the Center of Excellence is able to happen, because the board took some real deliberate steps to include that in the multi-year strategic plan. So what that allows is for those that are doing the work in schools to be validated. And so if it's part of the mission and vision of your board, of your building, of your learning network, your learning center, then it's something that you can be held accountable for. And so if we're saying that we could no longer allow or for our students to fail, and we're willing to put in the work in doing so, we will have the success that we all want. But I think it really does start with ensuring that this is part of the strategic plan going forward. It's embedded in the work that we're doing. It's being deliberately laid out within your board's mandate, so that those that are in positions of power can be held accountable. So yeah, I think those are just a couple ways of addressing that.
Thanks, Ainsworth. And rather than quickly summarizing, I'm going to pass it right to Beth to build on some of the foundation that Ainsworth has laid here around practical steps to be employed by all people who are trying to dismantle anti-Black racism and make a change for Black students and their families who are experiencing schooling in our public schools. So Beth, over to you.
I absolutely agree with Ainsworth. Thank you. And I'm full support of the idea of aligning it at all levels of the education system. That is so important. If people in the schools are on board and have creating new procedures and policies, but there's not that's not being aligned at the district level, then it'll fall apart, and vice versa. So yes, I agree 100%. All participants must do the individual self-reflective work first. Some people argue, I don't care about people's hearts and minds. I don't care. I just want them to stop hurting Black children. And I get that. And when it is the cases of overt racism and children are suffering, of course, I don't care about your heart and mind in that moment. We will deal with you. But we need to care about people's hearts and minds, because we can have the best resources. We can start hiring way more Black educators, Black principals and vice principals. We can have a new curriculum, but if the educators in the day-to-day, the teachers in the buildings and the staff in the buildings haven't dealt with themselves and their bias, it won't make a huge difference. And in BC, we've seen that on some level with our Indigenous movement to have Indigenous lens in schools and Indigenous curriculum created. I know it didn't solve everything, right? We still need to work on people's hearts and minds. So We can't solve a problem until we actually understand it. And that means we have to do that hard, heavy work of unpacking what racism looks like, feels like, sounds like, with students, with staff, with families, because our Black students and families are facing that in the school system. There's two sides to this, though. We have to listen. You really have to do that listening. But then our critics will say, it's not, what are you doing having Black children share their stories? Like, you can't, you're going to psychologically damage them. Are you just pulling them out and having them share their painful lived experiences just so that people can learn? Like, read a book, look at some history. Why are we bringing out families and students to do that work? And I get that. But if it's done properly, it is actually quite rewarding and uplifting for Black youth and families to have a voice at the table. We just recently, I work with a Black vice principal, Kenneth Headley here in BC. He's the only Black vice principal in his district. I'm the first Black person at the district level in over 100 years history in the Burnaby School District. We had one Black administrator, but she retired. We can count in all the larger Metro Vancouver districts, we can count the number of Black administrators on one hand, right? If there are any. And it's, it gets less and less as we move out. But we recently, Kenneth and I did an event for Black History Month, and we had a student panel, and they spoke about their very heavy and hard to hear stories of experiences of racism in school. But the students, we didn't just throw them on a panel and go. Like, there was a lot of work leading up to that people don't see behind the scenes. We talked with them, we talked about safety. Ken and I shared our experiences. We had other educators on there too, sharing their experiences. They got to know each other. We had to create a safe and brave space before doing that work. But I just worry that people are going to shut that voice down because it's so easy to say, oh, we can't listen to them. It's sometimes I find people hide behind that. They hide behind triggering. You're going to trigger people, so we can't do this work. You're going to trigger the students, so we can't talk to them about it. I just want people to be very careful, because the students all the time when we do these events have such positive experiences and give us such positive feedback that for the first time I felt heard. For the first time I could share my experience and know I was being listened to for real and without shame. So that's really good. I think people need to, as Ainsworth, I agree, work and do this work by walking with humility. That is so huge and so important to ground our work in humility, because we have to keep children at the center of what we do and not make it about the grown-ups, not make it about our egos, not pray. I can't stand it when people play the oppression Olympics, right? My genocide is worse than yours. Meanwhile, children's spirits are being diminished, right? We need to walk with each other and not operate out of separate silos. We need to bring different people and diverse voices to the table. We need, hate to say it, but we need other groups of people to do this work properly and for it to be sustainable. We actually need white folks to do this work and to understand it in order for this to be sustainable, right? Not saying they need to lead it, not saying they need to be in charge of it and run it. Often we have to say, get out of the way for Black voices, but they need to be at the table. They need to be part of it. Sometimes in this work, educators make this mistake, and I want people to hopefully not make this error that too many people do, and that is, I'm going to do better by Black students. I'm going to improve Black students' attendance, and really well-intentioned folks, right? I'm going to improve Black students' academic achievement. I'm going to make Black students have better conduct and better behavior, all with the best intentions. But that's another thing all participants need to do, and that is continuously keep checking in and checking your intentions, because that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. What we need to do instead of that is to improve our behavior, improve our conduct. We need to improve the school's culture. We need to improve the school's procedures and policies. And then maybe the students' in behavior and achievement and conduct will improve. We got to check ourselves first, improve the environment so that our Black students can achieve to their utmost full potential. It's the school and the system needs to check itself. We don't need to be focusing on Black and racialized students and how we're going to make them better. We need to make ourselves better. We need to make the system better. But we also need critical friends. Everyone needs to have a critical friend so they're safe to try this on, to be able to have those conversations. A lot of us have mentioned tonight Black fatigue, which is a very real thing because the status quo has a crazy way of pushing back and pushing back hard in all ways you wouldn't even expect from people and friends and colleagues. You're like, I didn't expect that from that person. But we need those critical friends to have these open discussions, try things on in a safe space. And that's for all participants. And yeah, the work can be exhausting, but there is hope. I think that's the last thing I'd say that everyone needs to have, all participants in this work, is hope.
Thank you, Beth, and certainly that opens up a whole lot of spaces for us to think about the kinds of things that need to happen. You know, some of the things that you've raised, both you and Ainsworth, and in fact the full panel is talking about that whole piece around where our hearts and minds are, and not just the hearts and minds of people who need to change or structures that need to change or people who need to participate in the change, but for the survival of Black families and Black communities, Black educators to look after themselves, right? Ainsworth, you started to talk about the whole idea of well-being and looking after yourself so that, you know, we think about sustainability and stamina. This is a long race, right? And you've all talked about the people who've gone before. You know, when we see the esteemed Jean Augustine speaking to us at the beginning here, we know that she has and continues to run a very long race. And so that stamina to be able to continue to do the work means that we have to look after each other and look after ourselves. But one of the key pieces that I do want to kind of just build on a little bit from the practical steps point of view is naming the commitment transparently, because that is where the accountability lies. That when it is that you identify that we own a challenge, we own a problem as a structure, as an institution, we own that the institution has created these barriers, and therefore we own, and this goes to the last thing you talked about, Beth, not the changing of the people, but changing of our behavior, our institutions, our structures in the interest of getting out of the way of others, that when we name that, that is where the accountability comes. But the last piece I will say, and this goes to what you started with, Ainsworth, is that when you take that ownership, that it is not the outcome or the behavior of students or their underperformance, but it is in fact the ownership of the institution that has created the barriers, created the oppression, created the anti-Black racism, and we take that ownership, that we're taking that ownership on the assumption and the given of Black excellence. And so, you know, we hear and we've heard said that every child is gifted. And so as every child comes to us with their gifts, what happens to impede those gifts from being realized? And so that is where the ownership comes. And I'm very famous amongst my peers for putting words in people's mouths. So I hope that I've actually captured what you have said in words that are actually accurate and moving us forward to the next part of this conversation. So thank you for you know, your very thoughtful reflections on the questions that you've had. And now at this point in our agenda, we are joined by what our esteemed colleagues have called discussants. When we're engaged with academia, we hear new words all the time. So I call them questioners, but Carl James called them discussants. So they are here with us to expand the discussion. And so we have D. Tyler Robinson from Toronto, Dr. Philip Howard from Montreal, and Malik Adams from Halifax, who are going to engage you at their will with the questions that they would like to pick up on. So might I turn it first to Dr. Philip Howard to take us on with the first question, and he will pass it in turn to the next discussants as we go through the three. And then we'll close off afterwards with some questions from our viewers. So over to you, Dr. Howard.
And thank you so much, Camille. Caught a little off guard there because I thought I was going second as a questioner, but that's fine. I'm ready to go. Good evening, everyone. I am speaking from Geojiage, which is the unceded territory of the Ghanaian Gahaga, otherwise known as Montreal. And I also am employed by McGill University, an assistant professor there. And we know that McGill University was made possible by the enslaved labor of Black and Indigenous people. My own personal history is that I was a longtime educator in secondary and elementary school in both Ontario and Quebec. And now I'm in a faculty of education. So I get to look at these kinds of issues from from multiple perspectives. One of the things I also get to do sort of, long-term kind of analysis. And so one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is to think about the ways in which there is supposedly this epiphany that has happened since the assassination of George Floyd. And, with a little bit of memory, we know that this, is a cycle, right? That perhaps we can't actually expect an epiphany right now. I mean, I can think to the Sir George affair in Montreal. I can think to the Yonge Street uprisings in Toronto. There are periodically these things that sort of supposedly raise attention and things are supposed to happen and then they die down. All panelists have spoken also about the issue, the need for political, systemic, and structural change, which I fully agree with. When I think about what Ainsworth said, for example, about the fact that the most valuable contributions for him are often coming from the informal school council or the informal networks that we have, that tells me a little bit about the fact that the existing structures actually don't engage the right folk, right? The folks who are most valuable are somehow not recognized within the formal structures. When I also think about the fact that whatever change has happened in education for Black families, Black communities, Black youth has been always the dogged, long, sustained work by Black communities and not the sort of momentary consciousness raising, so to speak, of institutions or white people in general. So my question is a very broad one, and I can't actually engage, direct it to any one panelist, but I would be interested to hear from as many as would respond about the kinds of things that you're thinking about doing in order to reimagine the system that we're in, because so often we think in terms of just creating greater inclusion into what we already have in some kinds of ways. I'm wanting to think about how we can begin to think about the institution itself very differently and how we can, as Black educators, actually engage with Black communities who, as Ainsworth again has noted, are the experts here. To continually listen and to continually make sure that there's a sustained call that doesn't depend on these, these momentary changes that seem to count for so much.
So it looks like, was that a hand up there, Beth, that you look like you wanted to start?
I'll start. It's very challenging, of course, because we have to work in this, the system that is systemically racist. So it's very hard to sort of push the boundaries and do different things, because when we want to take risks, there's not a lot of folks to support us in saying, let her take this risk, let him take that risk, let him take the chance to be different and do different. So it's really hard to do things differently, super challenging. So for me personally, I've taken full advantage of the racial reckoning that is this summer. I don't know how long this wave is going to last, but I'm going to ride it till it's done. And so I've been doing some things I would never normally do. I'm saying things I couldn't say white supremacist culture in a meeting a year ago, right? And so I'm pushing. I know that other Black colleagues are pushing. Some things that I'm doing differently, just as an example, and I've done this a little bit in the past as well, is that is push for having Black community groups be involved in the schools and like being okay with that and trusting that it's going to be okay. People are literally scared to do that. I'm telling you, literally scared to have Black leaders in the school building doing the work. I don't know what they think is going to happen, but it's people push back on it. So for me, I've been working with the Congress of Black Women, the BC chapter, amazing. And they bring in guest speakers and I'm come on in, right? And this year for the Black History Month, that symposium I talked about with the youth, we had 3,000 participants because it was virtual. It had to be virtual this year. So a silver lining of that was so many more people on the Zoom, so many more students across many districts. And we invited a Black activist from the community. That could never have happened before, never. So we had the head, Kamika Williams, who's the head of Anti-Racism Coalition Vancouver, who started the Black Shirt Initiative in BC, and she was the keynote speaker. So that's sort of the types of things that we're trying to do. Like, I don't know how long, like I said, I don't know how long this is going to last, but as long as it's happening, I hope it's forever. And I hope that if we keep doing this and showing and modeling that Black families, Black communities, Black groups and organizations have something positive to say, something positive to add, things aren't going to fall apart if we work with and walk alongside Black leaders and community groups. So that's how I'm trying to do something a little different. But I know you said beyond just including into what the regular system is, but that still does help because that's the start. So for many districts in BC who are starting these anti-racism ad hoc committees, where I believe the goal is to eventually write anti-racism policy for their districts, including anti-Black racism and specifically naming different types of racism. We're seeing districts like mine invite students of color, Black students and Indigenous students and Black parents to the table to do that work, which we'd never seen before. Not Black students and Black parents, I'm talking not students, period, not parents, right? And community members too, and reaching out to community folks to be at that table. So that's something that's exciting and hopeful that we're doing differently.
Thank you. There's a bit of a dimension I'd like to add as well that I missed the first time around, but it's just that one of the things that we see is that even if the conversation gets sustained, it moves away from Black folk really quickly, right? So soon we're not talking about anti-Black racism anymore. We're talking about racism, and then we're talking about equity and diversity, and then so it's again this tendency of the systems to remain the way that they are, so that they co-opt moments like these and co-opt the kinds of things that the people who are coming to the table are talking about. So I guess that's part of what I'm also thinking is, how do we keep it fresh with by hearing the community voices, which are the expert voices, and how do we watch out for those moments when the conversation gets changed by the very people in the institutions who are supposed to be on our side, perhaps, which sometimes can be the equity and diversity folk.
Thanks for the expansion, Dr. Howard. I think, Ainsworth, you wanted to expand a little bit, and I saw you as well, Letitia. So we'll have Ainsworth and Letitia, and then we'll move on to our next questioner, unless, of course, Dr. Howard would like to expand further. So Ainsworth, go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to add, I think, I think what's happening tonight is an excellent opportunity, because we know it's February, and often this is a time that, you know, the Black opportunity occurs. So I want to make sure that we understand we need to do this work beyond this month, as mentioned. But I think it's also important to hold each other accountable. And what I mean by that is, you know, a very good colleague of mine, Karen Murray, she talks about, you know, her baby birds, right? Those ones that are coming up, they, you know, they're green, they're ready to go, and we don't want to kill that kind of enthusiasm in our youngest educators. So we have to be able to mentor and feel comfortable. And I get it. Quite often when the position comes up, there's not a room for 5 of us, right? There's often just a room for 1. And so it all automatically pits you against your colleague. And adversely now, you are feeling that somehow this is your competition as opposed to your ally. This is your support. This is someone that you should be able to have a level of trust and relationship with. But I get it. It's a difficult piece, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, because when we get into certain spaces, knowing yourself, and I think that point that Beth spoke about, being very comfortable in who you are, knowing yourself, being comfortable in your skin, because if you don't, then others are going to define who you are. So you walk into that space, and I've seen it. So I walk into a space, it's either 1 or 2 responses when it comes to this work of anti-Black racism. They either exhale because they're like, okay, that means I don't have to do it anymore. The Black guy's here, he's going to be the one to take care of it. Or they hold their breath and they said, oh my God, now this Black guy's here, he's going to hold me accountable. So you have to recognize that you're going to be viewed, and then you need to then make a decision about how am I going to move forward with that understanding. And quite often our responsibility becomes you're the one that's been insulted quite often, but now you have to make others feel comfortable, right? And so recognizing that about the work is critical. Simple things that we can do when it talks about, I say in my building, a student, their first visit to my office should never be of a disciplinary nature. It should never be something negative. And I think that is an important understanding. So it's not becomes a place of discipline. It becomes a place that they feel that they can see themselves in a leadership role at some point, right? And making those simple things like sunshine calls. Do not engage parents just when it's about discipline or there's a problem for your child. Even if the child is having the most difficult day and time and year, there must be 5 minutes of goodness that has occurred that you can pick up the phone and say, Mr. So-and-so or Ms. So-and-so, I just want to let you know that your child did this wonderful thing. That goes a long way. We have to often be able to put ourselves on the other side of the table. And those of us, I'm not sure how many of you here are parents, but the first time you went to a parent conference about your own child, for me, my whole lens shifted in terms of how I speak to families, because it then became very real. And so those children are my children, right? And that's how I associate, when whether they look like me or they don't, they're all my children. And what I mean by that is holding them accountable, because they will hold me accountable. And when you talked about those informal conversations, I have a group of parents at my school that will tell me, Mr. Morgan, you need to do this. And then I say, yes, ma'am, right? Because I understand that's my role. My responsibility is to support them. So I had the pleasure of being on a call, and I just want to, with this last piece around the mentorship piece, it's a pleasure of being on a call with some educators from Windsor yesterday. And, there was the 5 of them, and they're Black educators, 4. And that was it. That's it for the entire school district. And you can feel how isolating that may be. So being able to, so if somebody reaches out, someone may see you on this Zoom tonight, and they reach out, it's okay to acknowledge and say, hey, what can I do to support, right? How can I help? because I'm very blessed to have a network, but not everyone has that same kind of safe space. So I think that's also something critical to speak to. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Ainsworth. And I'm going to turn to Letitia now to kind of round the corner with this question. And I do know that D. Tyler Robinson and Malik Adams are also waiting with questions for you. So Letitia, bring us home on this one.
So Dr. Howard, this question actually reminds me of a question you asked in class once about the bulldozer throwing the babies over the cliff and what are we to do? And that's a question that stuck with me throughout the last time that I seen you in school. And you essentially said that we need to catch the babies and stop the bulldozer. And I think that beyond the classroom, we have to at some point infiltrate the spaces that the stakeholders occupy. We need to be there making the policy changes. We need to be at that table included in the decision making. Right now in Quebec, our political leader does not believe systemic racism exists. We're dealing with a huge issue already just because of that. And even in the news recently was information about the minister that is now appointed to battle or combat racism is a white man. There's not enough representation. They don't understand, I guess, our view. And so we know that education is political and the stance that we have to take is political. And although we sometimes seem stagnant with conversations, these are also opportunities for us to grow and then challenge or subvert in our classrooms. It might be a grassroots level thing, but then this can translate to bigger things. It can translate to letter writing campaigns. It could translate to, for instance, a teacher deciding to pursue a career as being a minister of parliament or something whereby we can actually make shifts happen or change the narratives. And I think too often we just see the limitation, but not the opportunity. And I think just being here today is a huge sort of like new perspective or a new light shedding of how we can proceed and move forward.
Thank you all. Camille, I don't know if you were going to pass on to D. Tyler.
Yeah, I was going to pass it to D. Tyler, but thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for being here and for extending the conversation in this way. And babies and bulldozers, I'll definitely have to interrogate that analogy. It doesn't create a pretty picture, but I think we get the point. So D. Tyler Robinson is from Toronto. His bio certainly is on the website. And D. Tyler, if you're here and ready to turn on your camera, I know that you have a question to expand the conversation. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Camille. And I just want to say that it's really encouraging to hear so many educational leaders talk about owning the responsibility of creating this change so that folks such as myself, younger educators, can kind of do our thing to make the change that we want to see happen. So I really do appreciate that. And Ainsworth spoke about the importance of creating the deliberate steps of having a multi-year strategy so that you all in these positions of leadership can be held to that responsibility, right? So I want to direct my question to Beth and to Karen, if I could. In my most recent role in the TDSB, I led a project with some colleagues in creating a new grade 12 course called Deconstructing Anti-Black Racism in the Canadian and North American context. And the purpose of this course is really about uplifting Black youth and then building allyship in non-Black youth. And one of the things that was in my mind as we got down together to do this work was a comment from a student who said, honestly, sir, I don't want to be Black anymore. So when we think about what has to occur to bring a student to that place, we realize that there's quite the gap between educational theory as put forth by the various boards and ministries, and then what is happening in practice on a day-to-day basis. So in this course, obviously part of that course, kids have to deconstruct white supremacy, the notion of white as the default normal. But and when they do that, kids begin to learn that there's nothing wrong with their blackness. In fact, what is wrong is what has happened to their blackness, right? So they learn about race as a social construct. They learn about the role that capitalism and imperialism played in creating that social construct. They learn about the common omission of whiteness as a race. Beth, you mentioned performative allyship, so they learn about that, and they're mindful of that, like who really is with them. And Karen, I mean, thank you for saying Black fatigue. You know, because to be perfectly honest, I am tired. I'm really happy to be here with you all, but I'm tired. My colleagues and I have been subjected to hate mail since this process began, the overt form of racism, and I can deal with that. But my colleagues and I are also subjected to white administrators who give us all manner of reasons for why this course can't happen in their school, and don't understand the urgency and sometimes don't understand the care. So the question that I want to put forth to you all really is a question that I hope parents can kind of have a takeaway here. I was brought to this conversation from a parent, and while we wait for the boards and the provinces to implement K through 12 strategies to really deal with anti-Black racism, I'm wondering if you can share with parents, you know, what kind of strategies, what kind of approaches, what kind of tools can parents perhaps utilize as they try to deal with these issues head on, as Gail Ann mentioned, and in appropriate ways for the different age ranges of students.
Thanks, Dee Tyler, and you called out Gail, so I'm going to turn the question to Gail, because certainly, Gail, you did in your previous answers talk about organizing and empowering. So could I turn it to you to start us off in responding to Dee Tyler's question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And, you know, it's wonderful also getting to speak on behalf of being a parent of children from a racialized background. So I'm just going to ask once again, can you just clarify specifically what you're looking for? So you were asking about parents. Can you just repeat that for me?
Yeah, certainly. As we wait for the various boards and ministries of education to implement, you know, K through 12 strategies that deal with anti-Black racism, parents are left with the sense of, what do I do now? You know, what do I do now to build up my child, to make them love their Black self, to focus on Black joy and Black excellence? What are the strategies and tools that parents can utilize now while we wait for all of this work to occur? What can they do? What would you suggest, or what are some ideas?
I love that. I think what really captures me is that you said, while we wait for this to happen. And it's really poignant, because it should be in motion and it should be in action. I think when I say this, most of us are going to immediately recognize what it is, and it's the talk. It's a talk that we have with our children about what it is like to be Black within a community in which we're addressed as the minority. I think that it's embedded in many parents for us to actually promote excellence in our children, and to promote quite a bit of pride in our culture, in our skin, in the way that we express ourselves. The challenge is just what has previously been mentioned, which is trying to have our children feel confident in that expression when they are going into schools where they tend to be regarded or marginalized as the minority group. So I believe that what we can do is continue to show our children that there are so many positives about expressing ourselves authentically, as opposed to you know, color coding, I believe was the term, or color
code switching.
Code switching.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, so I think that the more that we're able to continually support our children in the authentic expression of who they are, and that they don't have to actually leave that as soon as they get off a bus or they enter into a building, and that they're able to freely speak to promote themselves as Black individuals, I think that that's going to be a very powerful step that our parents can take. But I want to actually just go one tiny step further, and that is about what we're calling this moment of pause, or the waiting for the next thing to happen. And what I would speak to with that is we have to ask our schools to take a look at the pedagogical background of the people that are going to be leading this next step. We have a lot of teachers, or we have a lot of boards or community members that believe in the saviorism aspect of things, and that their role is to actually take the pain away and to move our children out of this situation so that they don't have to fully experience their Blackness. And so the challenge that I have for our leaders is to actually create some consciousness around how we can actually prepare teachers, prepare school boards, and prepare administrators to deliver the kind of education around being Black, around Black culture, that has them deal with their authentic awareness of what they're doing and where they are beginning their process. So what I mean by that is for us to allow for all of us involved in this to address where our starting point is. Going back to the parents have a very clear idea of where their starting point is with their children. They tend to, or we tend to, prepare our children to move out into a world that's going to throw quite a bit of challenges at us because of our melanin. So what we need to do is we need to onboard everybody from the top down, from our highest leaders in education all the way down to those classroom teachers. We need to onboard people to start recognizing where they're beginning their process before they start to deliver some of these lessons and some of these initiatives. Because we are getting people that are coming into this, as I've mentioned, with acts of saviorism in ways that are actually taking the power away from those kids, that those parents are actually imparting in them. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Galen. And I don't know, detail, or if you felt that your answer, you got your answer there. It was quite a robust response with a lot of layers to it. And you've added in the layer of saviorism, because one of the things we do recognize is some of these very behaviors are in fact the colonial issues or the colonial practices that created the problem. And I think we mentioned that in an earlier question. So I'm moving us along because I do recognize the time, and I'd like to be able to get to, sorry?
Can I say something on that question?
Oh, sure, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that within Nova Scotia, one of the things that we try to do is really center our students in their culture. So we allow them to, we come from an Afrocentric philosophy so that they know that they are brilliant, they're scholars, they come from excellence, they come from kings and queens, and we try to embed that in everything that we do. Within some of our schools, and particularly my school and with the organizations that I work with, we try to make sure that we listen to our children. So we tell parents, listen to your children. When your children come home and they say things have happened, the N-word has been used, that they've been called out their name, listen to them, believe in them, understand that what they're saying to you, or they're telling you the truth. So we have to educate ourselves as well. And we said it over and over and over in terms of, you know, challenge the system. Well, we got to challenge them to think differently, to change their mindset in terms of how they do work and how they deliver work. Make sure that what they give to our children is not always a negative. We know about slavery, but let's talk about some of those positive contributions in history that we try to ignore. Let's talk about, from my own place where I come from, Nova Scotia, our 48 Black communities that have been here, the migration of people that have been here. And when they came here, that we had individuals who, 1605, Matthew DeCosta, we need to make sure that we equip our children with the information and the knowledge so that they believe in who they are. We also got to make sure that when we work with parents, that we come from a place of communal. That's what Afrocentricity does. It makes people feel that you're part of a community. It's a communal way of doing things. So it's not by yourself, it's a family, and you're part of that family. So once we get that information and then we center our children always in who they are, which is their rich history, then we're able to move forward. So I just wanted to say that point because D. Taylor had said, what do you do? Would love to really go into it more, but I know Camille is pressing us for time here.
And Camille, if I may, just super quick.
Well, I'm just worried about not getting to the audience's questions.
I promise, parents, go to the school, make your voice heard. Now is the time, ride that wave. That's all I need to say. And if you're at a family, you're one of the one and only or one of the few, this is what you say. There is a ramp outside the school. There are special washrooms and special equipment for just 1 or 2 students at the school with special needs and who are physically challenged. Not to compare Black folks to physically challenged folks, but that works. The people right now, you have the floor, go to the school, get your voice heard, advocate for your child, don't be scared. This is the time. If not now, then when is?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Malik, because I know you're waiting and you have a question for the panelists. And if you wish to direct your question, you're certainly free to do that. Over to you.
Camille, thanks so much. Thanks everyone for your insight, your responses all night. Coincidentally, Karen's last response actually segues to my question. I want to center this question on Afrocentricity and things that are African-centered. So my current role, I'm in a school. So 20 years teaching, and then the last several years I've moved over to counseling, guidance counseling in the same school, and always working with Black students. And of course, we look at things holistically. So when you work with Black students, it's with community, it's with parents, it's with family, so on and so forth. Other than my experiences working with our children, it's certainly informed by Afrocentricity. It's certainly informed by African-centered principles, practices, processes, philosophies. So my question is, and I'm mindful of time, so I would say, one, Karen, I don't need you because you alluded to it. Maybe 1 or 2 other people at the most. And talk a little bit about how everything that we dealt with tonight, how do African-centered practices, processes, and or principles fit into the work we're trying to do for our Black students?
Ainsworth, would you, I keep forgetting to turn my camera on. Ainsworth, you want to give us a start up on that one, the centeredness of African realities?
Yeah, I think, it's normalizing that. I don't think, we need to have this fanfare again around February. This work is done year round. We start from a place that, for me, I don't really start with an understanding of when you're talking about Black history, we sort of stay away from the sports and entertainers. Our students know them quite well. We are really STEM focused. The names, so if you're doing the sports, and look, who are the managers, who are the accountants, who are, when you're talking about, professional sports, the Raptors, we're not talking about Kyle Lowry, we talk about Masai, because you want them to understand there's different aspects to who we are. Yes, we're brilliant athletes. Yes, we're brilliant entertainers. Absolutely. Embrace that, love that. But we also many other things. We're poets, right? We're scientists, right? We're doctors, we're lawyers, we're many things. So I think it's normalizing that for the students and their families. You're not creating this add-on. It's embedded in what you're doing on a daily basis. So when February comes around, this work is just enhanced, right? It's not the add-on for the month. This is just another month in a yearly work that we do.
Over to you, Gail Ann. Thanks, Ainsworth.
Ainsworth, thank you very much for phrasing it as the add-on. The way that I look at it is very similar, but it's taking a look at deconstructing the narrative of the curriculum that we're presenting to our kids. I think that we can reshape the way that that we look at Afrocentricity by creating a better understanding of that power dynamic that arose from colonialism and imperialism. So I think that if we're able to do that, then as Ainsworth said, what we end up with is not treating this like a novelty, but actually creating a space for it within within our lessons, within our curriculum, and ultimately within our consciousness, so that we can actually see Afrocentricity celebrated as not something that's just novel.
Thank you for that, Gail. And it's very interesting because I'm not sure if anyone is bringing in the perspective as well of the colonial experience from those who are from the Caribbean and South America. I heard Kiki Ojo speak the other day, and pertaining to Africa, she talked about the importance of getting right with Africa. And so when you are a person of African descent that comes out of a Caribbean experience or a South American experience, oftentimes colonialism has worked so effectively that we separate ourselves from the realities of what it is that Africa has taught us about how to be and how to know ourselves. And so I thought that that statement that Kiki made in her presentation certainly was poignant. And it certainly came to my mind, and Malik's question is getting right with Africa. But I'm going to move to there. We have a couple of questions here, so we'll allow everybody on the panel to speak again, because it takes us into a couple of different directions here. And one of the questions is around tokenism. And a couple of you have raised the whole idea of being the only one, being, when people are isolated. Ainsworth, you talked about, talking to people who for in the entire district, right? And so this question comes from Jonelle Morvan. And Jonelle asked the question, how do we make sure that tokenism and false diversity motives are not used to sidetrack the fight against anti-Black racism in educational spaces? So certainly a strong statement about some institutional moves that may not be authentic, but might derail the work. So how do we make sure that tokenism is not used to sidetrack the fight against anti-Black racism? So I don't know who wants to catch that one. Beth?
I can speak a little bit if I think I'm understanding the question. And so, for example, I'll just start with, the fact that I'm the first at the district level in my district in over 100 years, the fact that I'm super light skinned is not lost on me, right? Like I'm closer to that center of privilege and power because I'm light skinned, right? And we see that in other institutions when people move up, people of color who move up. And I have to be aware of that in this work. But I think one thing that we can do to fight this so it doesn't become about the tokenism, we just admit it, accept it, acknowledge it, but we got to work with it, right? We have to it doesn't serve me to call out folks on that right now when I've just arrived. Does that make sense? Like we need to be able to do the work, and I'm not saying that it's okay. I'm just saying it's a step. And what I'm facing, for example, is sometimes folks will think because of the position, because of the power that comes with the position, like whether you're a VP or a principal or work at the district level, that some people can't see that the person is a person of color, the person is BIPOC, the person is Black specifically, right? So because you're administrator, you can't get it. Because you are in a position of leadership, you don't understand. You can't get what it feels like to experience racism or have anti-Black racism be. It's not a reality for you. You couldn't possibly understand, and that has to stop, because it is kind of it is insulting And I'm thinking maybe a bit discriminatory and biased if people can't see a leader as a Black person with Black experience, right? What does that tell you when people can't see the Black leaders as people having lived Black experience, and that they could relate or even understand? That's how powerful anti-Black racism is that some folks just can't even see at the same time, it can't exist in their brain at the same time, that Black leaders are Black folks.
So when we talk about tokenism, and thank you, Beth, for that, because it certainly goes to the whole thing about the fact that identities are sometimes invisible, can't make assumptions about what they are. But I think the questioner is moving to the notion that sometimes institutions put one person in place to check a box and say, good, we've done it. Here we've got a Black teacher, a Black principal, a Black educator, a Black director. So check, done. And I think the questioner is going to the place of how it is that we ensure that it's not done. And that it is in fact not divesting organizations of having to be responsible for moving anti-Black racism forward. So Malik, I didn't take the hint before when you turned on your camera, but now you put up your hand. So I think you want to jump in and take us on with that question. Do you have something to add to that, Malik?
No, I actually just turned on my camera because I was told to. So so that's why.
But now you're here, Malik.
Yeah, no, now you're right. So I guess that's an interesting question. I guess the simplest way to put it for me, and we all have agency in this, in our capacities, in our life experience and professional experience, and what we do as Black educators. I mean, it's a challenging one, but here's what I would say: no matter what happens, that especially when it relates to our children, no move should ever happen without the stamp of the community. Absolutely none. And however that's done, it will look differently in different circumstances, but that has to be a fundamental principle that we operate by. And that's one of the ways that you can impact and obviously prevent that quote unquote tokenism, because that's one thing that we can relate to all around the world. We often ask for things that we're not really prepared for when we get it. So we think we want it, but then we don't. So yes, of course, we're always looking for employment opportunities, and we're looking for all of these opportunities to create for ourselves and our children and all of those things. And I'm specifically talking about employment because then what happens is the way the system works, and I love Dr. Phillips' question about reimagining how things are, is that we go to a table and we ask for jobs, and that's what we get. We get Black people in jobs, and that's where it ends. They're not conscious Black people. They're not Black people whose worldview is informed by Afrocentric practices or principles. They really can just hire any old Black person, which is what we should actually expect. But one of the ways that we can disrupt and interrupt that is that we make sure, however that looks, that the community, whoever we are, don't allow that to happen. Right. So anytime somebody parades somebody in front of you, our response should be, if we didn't choose that person doesn't represent us. And so now we have to go back to the drawing board to make sure that we get the person that represents us.
And I agree with Malik in terms of on the tokenism. I think we always have to, we can't lose sight of who we are. We have to be purposeful in terms of what our intentions are and who we are there for. And so it is actually going back to that communal piece, that community, that family. And we talked earlier about that community represents a lot of people, not just your immediate, but your extended and the whole family in terms of the whole school community. So you have to be purposeful and true to yourself in terms of that position. So if that's how you take it as being token, then you're in there for the wrong reason. But if you're taking it for being in there fighting for Black people and fighting against, in terms of anti-Black racism and fighting for the true reason, then you'll be disrupting and you'll be making change as opposed to just allowing status quo and the norm to exist.
Can I just
Karen,
add?
Yeah, I'll close with you, Dorothea, but Karen, just to reiterate your point, there's a distinction. You've made the distinction between being the only one and being token. And so thank you for making that distinction, because it's a clear one. So Ainsworth, I see you. And Leslie, I think you're here to say the game's over. So I will pass it over to you after Ainsworth has had the last word. Go ahead, Ainsworth.
I'll be real quick. And I just reiterate the point by Karen. Yeah, not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? And I think it's important to recognize that, because often some folks are put into leadership positions because they're that safe choice, and they're not going to, disrupt. So we need to recognize that. And another thing I will say, when you're in positions of leadership, you're going to be viewed quite often as arrogant. You're going to be viewed as someone that thinks they know it all. Embrace it. You understand? I don't shy away from that. Embrace it, because irregardless of what they say about you, you need to know yourself, right? The self-love, it starts there. So embrace that, because they're going to think that way irregardless of how you move in the world. Love self, so that you can then show your students, you can model how your students, your family should move through the world. That's it.
Well, folks, we are at 2 minutes to 9, and so that puts us 3 minutes over time. And so I believe Saima and Leslie are here to wrap us up, but I do thank you all for, the conversation was just getting warm, and as true to our community, things get warm, and then we now have to move on. So thank you very much for a very candid conversation and the opportunity to be a part of it with you today. And I'll pass it back to Saima to take us to our closing remarks and our closure for the evening. So thanks all.
Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I know I got an email from Camille at 2 a.m. in the morning. Why I was up to receive it, don't ask. But that's the lived reality of the time of year and the kinds of people that we brought together here. All of you are so incredibly dedicated, and we are so much richer as a community, educational community, and as a people community to have leaders such as you to be here. So thank you so much. I know how busy we all know how busy every single one of you are, and especially given that it is February. And so let's hope that you're a little bit less busy after February, but you're still busy, because we want the conversations to continue. So thank you so much. On behalf of the Jean Augustine Chair, the Leslie, if you'd like to speak to ABC, our sponsors, Unifor, as well as a network for the advancement of Black communities. We thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing all this wealth of information. And I had a whole bunch of points that I actually have like a whole bunch of writing that I had to get more and more paper, but we're not gonna have time for that. And I know everybody's minds are full. So we will just end it with thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And please keep up the good fight, and know that we are all connected here. This is part of the beauty of, not that anybody wants this time to happen, but the fact that we can all come together, and we know that we're all coming together and not working in our silos, I think is incredibly empowering. And that fatigue, that's real. So if we can support each other, we've hopefully provided a network here where we can expand our support for each other and for the work that's happening in communities. So thank you very much. And on behalf of all of us at York University, as well as our partners and sponsors, we wish you all a very great evening.